Read a second time. I call the member for Maitland.
Thank you, Madam Acting Speaker. Everyone has the right to go to work and earn a living and not lose their health or indeed their life at work. This was a fundamental premise of our workers' compensation system until 2012 when the O'Farrell government changed the rules. Labor knew, the unions knew and the community knew what the impact of these changes would be. We saw one of the most significant campaigns against a single piece of legislation back in 2012, but throughout it all, as is their way, this government ignored the advice of those who knew the impact of its cuts and pressed on with its ideological agenda. They cut away at workers' compensation like it was a line item in a budget and in so doing fundamentally failed our community. They just didn't think about the human cost of this massive cost shift. While workers were forced onto Centrelink, Medicare, third-party motor vehicle insurance claims to try and address their injuries sustained at work, their suffering was nothing to this government. Some were even left with no options. The government stripped away the protections of journey claims so that workers injured on their way to and from work were not covered. People in my electorate work long shifts and fatigue's often a factor. Sometimes they live 2 or 3 hours away from home and commuting times have a serious impact on them getting home safely. People like Andrew in my electorate who injured his shoulder driving home from work one day and was unable to continue working his career. The government cut people off ongoing benefits, so women like Cheryl, a hard-working nurse who came into my electoral office this month, is going to now be fitted with a device that by 2018 she will be solely responsible for in terms of cost. The cost of batteries for this will be in excess of $28,000 every 8 to 10 years, plus the cost of the procedure itself. Absolute disgrace. The government stood by while Katie, a 15-year-old girl from my electorate who'd fallen over 3 metres from a fuel tanker, battled insurance companies to seek payment for expenses that she had to use to seek medical treatment in Sydney. This young girl continues to suffer damage caused to nerve endings in her neck as well as a head injury, dehydrated vertebrae, headaches, the loss of the use of her right hand, damage to her reproductive system and an injury to her back. She has decreased function in her bladder and bowel failure and now has a pacemaker in her bladder with complications of anemia produced by a slow bleed. After all this time on workers' compensation, waiting while this government has failed to hear her cries, she is declining, and the changes to the legislation have left her high and dry with no assistance for services, equipment or medication that she requires on a daily basis. Her doctors have told her that while she may one day technically be able to have a baby, the state of her body means that she would not be able to continue with the impacts of the pregnancy upon her body. The psychological impacts have also taken their toll on Katie, with nightmares, terror of heights and stairs, and the loss of her future dreams of parenthood just adding to the toll. And even though both sides agree that work cover needs to be restructured, this government is still playing games, still playing with people's lives and futures, blackmailing us by refusing to split these cognate bills and not committed to helping people at work. They are trying to make us complicit in their attacks on workers, but they will not be successful. Some of the changes that Labor can support in this bill, but we will not agree to injured workers being worse off than they were before 2012. We do not disagree with the restructure of work cover, but to take a number of independent bodies and remove their autonomy is a step too far. We cannot stand for that. For example, we're completely opposed to the Dust Disease Control Board being stripped of its independence and turned into a political wing of this government. It's absurd and dangerous. It was established as a service in 1910 for workers installing Sydney's sewer network who were suffering from a new condition caused by concrete or cement dust called silicosis. The board was legislated in 1930 as farmers and farmhands became aware they were suffering from a very similar condition, and it became known as farmer's lung and was caused by the airborne dust from crops. It's astounding to me that our colleagues from the National Party are supporting this. In the 1960s, it became seriously involved in the developing condition of asbestosis. There are substantial benefits to having an independent board to oversee dust disease. Nationally, more than 600 people are diagnosed every year with dust diseases. Most of them are men, and victims can be diagnosed more than 20 years after exposure. The Dust Disease Board can process most claims within 30 days, and once diagnosed, most victims live only 12 months. So quick and efficient processing is very paramount in this situation. The Board assists with daily requirements like ramps to access homes, renovating showers and bathrooms, installing oxygen generators for homes, providing oxygen tubes to allow travel, lawn mowing services, etc. Just last week, asbestos disease victims groups, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union and the ALP branded the move to abolish the board as heartless, and rightly so. Even though the government says changes to the workers' compensation scheme won't reduce compensation payments for dust disease victims, it's feared that the valued social services that go along with these payments will be lost. I am really concerned to hear that Asbestos Disease Foundation of Australia President Barry Robson was not consulted about the changes. What a disgrace to leave out such an important stakeholder in this debate. I support the opposition spokesman for Finance and Services when he says the government has guaranteed only that the Dust Disease Board's role in managing compensation would be unaffected. The DBB also manages social aspects for victims and their families, like getting ramps installed, as I said before. And these important ancillary social services will not be protected. Although we agree that there's a dire need for overhaul and to return some of these rights to our workers, we can't ignore a set of bills which puts people in a worse position. As the member for Cessnock says, you cannot repair and heal on one end while you knife and wound on the other. Regardless of which side of the aisle you occupy, it's hard to disagree with ANWU Secretary of New South Wales, Tim Ayres, when he says the Dust Diseases Board have been the moral compass of every New South Wales government and premier for more than 85 years, and that the board ensures that the many victims of one of Australia's worst industrial killers are compensated. And as someone who's worked with older people for the last 17 years, I've known a number of men who've been diagnosed with this condition and have ultimately died of mesothelioma. Men who were vital and living, still taking holidays with their wonderful wives, who ended up dying too soon due to this terrible disease. In my electorate, Metsford resident Rhonda Pilgrim began her relationship with the board in April 2014 when her husband Ian was diagnosed with mesothelioma. She says the service was invaluable and made his terminal condition more bearable. From paying upkeep of the family home to his funeral when he died in February this year, Rhonda says the Dust Diseases Board helped her and Ian out whenever they could, including paying travel expenses for his treatment and all his medication costs. Rhonda worries that the government's decision could spell further heartache for asbestos victims and their families. And when just this year, on a whim, the government reduced licensing requirements for painters and other tradespeople, which will heighten the risk for workers and families who live in some of the oldest homes in our state, where there are lots of buildings who are full of asbestos, this is even worse. Who will be around to advocate for those workers and their families? Labor will support the Workers' Compensation Amendment Bill eventually, but we will oppose the State Insurance Care Governance Bill, and we will seek to have cognate bills separated to ensure that the government is clear in what their intentions are, because we're sick of unintended consequences from a government which has no heart and no concern for the people of New South Wales.